por aquí salieron corriendo como rata, como alma que lleva el diablo, cuando el pueblo se fue a la calle a defender la revolución bolivariana.
If you're listening to this podcast, you've probably heard of Hugo Chávez. He ruled Venezuela for almost 14 years, until his death in 2013. In the 2000s, Chavez became a global symbol, anti-American, anti-establishment, and anti-elite. The man who stood at the United Nations and called George Bush the devil in front of the world.
Ayer estuvo el diablo aquí, en este mismo lugar, huele a azufre todavía.
But that was not the Chavez who first ran for president. When Chavez got out of prison in 1994, he didn't believe in elections. He thought Venezuela's political system was so rotten, so controlled by the country's elites, that taking power through the ballot box was impossible. Eventually, he changed his mind. At first, Chavez was treated as a joke. In late 1997, he was polling around 5%. Venezuela's politicians, businessmen, and television networks all assumed he had no chance of winning. That is, until suddenly, he did. But how did this happen? How did a failed coup leader, fresh out of prison, go from 5% in the polls to the presidency in barely a year? When we left off this story, Chavez was sitting in a prison after leading a military coup in 1992 that came very close to taking power, but failed. In the previous episode, we saw how the democratic system that replaced Venezuela's military dictatorships slowly began to rot. Politicians, businessmen, and the country's richest families had all become part of the same club. Venezuela's enormous oil wealth had created a giant state. But by the 1990s, that system was falling apart. Inflation was above 20%, more than half the country was living in poverty, and in the eyes of many Venezuelans, the only people still benefiting were the corrupt elites with the right connections. These were the oligarchs Chavez promised to destroy. But you know what they say, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Because before Chavez conquered Venezuela, he first made a deal with the very people he claimed to hate. Once a year, masked devils dance through the streets of San Francisco de Yare, a small town just outside Caracas. They come in red with twisted horns and grotesque masks. Rosaries hang from their necks. They dance to the sound of drums and maracas, faster and faster, until finally they arrive at a church. And there, before its doors, one by one, the devils kneel, surrendering after the symbolic battle between good and evil. This tradition is known as the Dancing Devils of Yare, and coincidentally, Yare is also the home to the prison where Hugo Chávez was held after his failed coup attempt in 1992. And as Chávez sat in that prison cell, another man was preparing his return to power, former President Rafael Caldera. Caldera had helped create the political system that governed Venezuela after 1958. He was one of the founders of COPEI, one of the two parties that had alternated power with Acción Democrática for nearly 40 years. But by the early 1990s, the system was collapsing. Corruption, patronage, and economic decline had turned much of the country against the old order. So in 1993, Caldera did something unexpected. He broke with his own party and ran for president as an outsider. You might remember from our first episode that after Chávez's coup attempt, Caldera reinvented himself. He founded a new party called Convergencia and assembled an unlikely alliance of 17 smaller parties, many of them leftist movements that had never before governed in Venezuela. His opponents mocked the coalition as El Chiripero, meaning a swarm of little cockroaches. Caldera promised to save Venezuelan democracy by changing it. He spoke of a new constitution, a new political system, and a new economic model. And he won. But he won with just 30% of the vote, the lowest share ever won by a victorious presidential candidate in modern Venezuelan history. It was the first time since 1958 that neither COPEI nor Acción Democrática had won the presidency. But by the time Caldera took office in 1994, Venezuela was already falling into another crisis. The second largest bank in the country, Banco Latino, collapsed, followed by a dozen other banks that had to be taken over by the government. Prominent bankers linked to economic elites fled abroad to avoid prosecution, including Caldera's own son-in-law. The rescue consumed an enormous share of the government's resources and confirmed what many Venezuelans had already believed, that the country was rotting from within. The time and money spent saving the banks destroyed any hope of Caldera bringing the new model he had promised. Within months, the man who had vowed to save Venezuelan democracy was trapped inside the same decaying system he had promised to replace. Then, in 1994, Caldera made the most important decision of his presidency. He released Hugo Chávez. The same day of his release, Chávez gave a press conference. Dozens and dozens of reporters swarmed on him, pushing their microphones against others as cameramen fought for the best shot of the failed coup leader. Chávez was surrounded by so much chaos, people, microphones, and cameras, that he barely got words out. Strictly speaking, Chávez was not pardoned. He had never been convicted. Caldera simply ended the legal proceedings against him and the other officers involved in the 1992 coup attempts. But that raises the question, why would Caldera do that? The simple answer is that Caldera never imagined Chávez could become a real threat. During his first presidency, Caldera had brought former guerrillas back into politics and neutralized them. He believed Chávez would follow a similar path, become another angry voice on the margins, another ex-officer giving speeches, another small party winning a few votes. He thought Chávez would just disappear, but he was wrong. Now, it's important to remember that Chávez was not yet the unquestioned leader of the movement he came to lead. He was the face of the coup, certainly. He was charismatic, eloquent, and already more famous than any of the other conspirators. But inside the movement, he was still only one leader among several. The first few months after the coup were very difficult for him. Chávez felt personally responsible for the failure. Many of the other officers blamed him as well. They believed that he had hesitated at a crucial moment, that he had failed to carry out his part of the plan, and then surrendered way too quickly. The movement that had once been united in secret now began to divide over the next question: what should come next? Some believed that they should return to the barracks and prepare for another uprising. Others argued that the old system was so rotten and Chávez so popular that they should try to take power through elections. Chávez rejected that idea. He believed that the political system was rigged beyond repair. The same parties, the same businessmen, and the same elites who had ruled Venezuela for decades would never allow a movement like theirs to win, he thought. Instead of participating, Chávez traveled across the country urging Venezuelans not to vote at all. His slogan was "Por ahora, por ninguno." For now, vote for no one. But not everyone agreed. One of Chávez's closest allies, Francisco Arias Cárdenas, broke with him. Arias Cárdenas had led the takeover of Zulia during the 1992 coup, and was widely seen as the second most important figure in the movement. Unlike Chávez, he believed elections could be used against the old system. So in 1995, Arias Cárdenas ran for the governorship of Zulia. 3 years earlier, he had seized the governor's mansion at gunpoint during the coup. Now, he was trying to win it through the ballot box. And he did. Francisco Arias Cárdenas won the governorship of Zulia in 1995, becoming the first of the former coup plotters to prove that the movement could translate its popularity into votes. For Chávez, it was a revelation. If Arias Cárdenas could win in Zulia, perhaps the system was not as closed as he had imagined. Perhaps the old parties were really weaker than they looked. Slowly, Chávez changed his mind. By 1997, the movement decided to enter politics. But they couldn't use their name, the Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement, MBR, because Venezuelan law prohibited political parties from using the name of Simón Bolívar in their name. So Chávez created a new party, the Movement for the Fifth Republic, Movimiento Quinta República, MVR. The new name reflected the movement's central promise. Venezuela, Chávez argued, needed more than a new president. It needed a new constitution, a new political system, a new republic. The Fifth Republic. But even after Chávez founded his party, Venezuela's political and economic elites still dismissed him. A political party on paper meant nothing without any real campaign machine. The new party, the Fifth Republic movement, was full of former military officers. They knew how to plan an operation, not an election. They didn't know how to organize rallies, mobilize voters, or build neighborhood networks. Chávez had supporters, yes, but he didn't yet have a campaign. And Chávez also had another problem. Many Venezuelans were afraid of him. He spoke about smashing the oligarchy and sweeping away the old political class. Critics called him violent, authoritarian, even fascist. Many voters, especially women and the middle class, worried that the former coup leader wanted to become a military strongman. So Chavez needed two things: a political machine and a new image. He found the first by joining forces with several parties on the Venezuelan left in a coalition that became known as the Polo Patriótico. Apart from his own, the two most important parties in that coalition were Patria para Todos and Movimiento al Socialismo. These parties were established, and they gave Chavez something he desperately needed: experienced organizers, local networks, and candidates across the country. Chavez no longer looked like a lone former colonel surrounded by ex-soldiers. He looked like the head of a real political movement. The second problem was solved by reinventing Chavez himself. The red beret disappeared, and so did the military fatigues. Chavez began appearing in a suit and tie, often beside his wife at the time. The campaign wanted Venezuelans to stop seeing him as a coup leader and to start seeing him as a statesman, a family man.
Yo aprovecho para hacer un llamado a todo el mundo. Yo no soy el diablo. Yo soy un hombre que va con los mejores lazos de hermandad a trabajar conjuntamente con todos los países de América Latina, de Norteamérica y del mundo entero.
On television, Chavez insisted that he was not a communist, that he would not nationalize private businesses. In one interview, he declared, "We want neither socialism nor communism."
No queremos socialismo ni comunismo. No lo queremos. Donde coexistan el Estado y el mercado, donde haya trabajo, propiedad privada, educación, seguridad social, pero no para un grupito, sino para todos.
In another, he called Cuba a dictatorship and denied that he wanted to rule as a military dictator. But Chavez never completely abandoned the other version of himself. At one rally, he promised to wipe Acción Democrática off the face of the earth. At another, he said he would fry the heads of the old politicians. He understood that millions of Venezuelans were furious. Many of them were not looking for reconciliation. They wanted revenge. They wanted someone who could make the old elites pay, someone who would destroy the system. Former President Carlos Andrés Pérez understood this better than anyone, as he explained in an interview during the 1998 election.
Si usted ve las encuestas, no hay nadie más que Chávez.
There's no one other than Chavez.
Porque este pueblo no está votando por un presidente. Aquí se está votando por un vengador.
Because the Venezuelan people are not looking for a president. They're looking for an avenger. And Hugo Chávez was exactly that. Everyone in Venezuela could see that the two parties that had dominated politics for decades were finished. Venezuelans despised Acción Democrática and COPEI, and the businessmen who had prospered alongside them could also see that. So, as the 1998 election approached, another battle was unfolding behind the scenes. For decades, Venezuela's richest families had shaped politics from the shadows. They owned television stations, banks, factories, and newspapers. Politicians depended on them for money, for media access, and sometimes even for their own livelihoods. One politician, for example, when asked by a journalist how he supported himself, answered bluntly, "I live off of the generosity of my friends," he said. But here's the important thing to understand. These businessmen were not one united clique that moved in the same direction. Venezuela's oligarchy was divided, always at each other's throats. Different families and business groups had spent years competing with one another for influence over the state, over ministries, contracts, banks, and above all, the oil wealth that flowed through Caracas. Under the old system, they usually knew who to back. Different groups had their preferred candidates and parties, showering them with money, television time, and political support. In exchange, of course, for future access and favors. But now the old political order was collapsing. The traditional parties were dying, and for the first time in decades, no one knew who would inherit the Venezuelan state. So Venezuela's elites began searching for a new champion, the person who they'd help win the presidency, and who in return would protect their interests and help them defeat their business rivals. Behind closed doors, they weighed the candidates. By 1998, 4 figures had emerged at the center of that struggle. The first prospect was Irene Sáez, former Miss Universe and mayor of Chacao, the richest and smallest district in the country. To many Venezuelans, Sáez looked like exactly what the country needed. She was glamorous, successful, and untouched by the discredited parties. To many businessmen, she looked even better, a fresh face who could preserve their power without preserving the old politicians. By the end of 1997, she was leading the polls with nearly 70% support. But then her campaign slowly imploded. Chavez struggled in interviews. She seemed unprepared, and worst of all, she accepted the endorsement of Copey. Overnight, she stopped looking like an outsider and started looking like another candidate in the old system. Within months, her support had collapsed below 15%. Then there was Luis Alfarrusero, the aging party boss of Acción Democrática. Alfarrusero had spent his life inside the machinery of Venezuelan politics. During the dictatorship of Marcos Pérez Jiménez, he helped organize Acción Democrática from hiding. But by 1998, he had become the embodiment of the very system Venezuelans wanted to bury. Some businessmen tied to the old Acción Democrática machine still saw him as their safest option, but outside of those circles, almost no one wanted him. Even inside his own party, many leaders desperately wanted someone else. But Alfarrusero insisted, and his campaign never escaped the single digits. The third candidate was Enrique Salas Romer, the governor of the state of Carabobo. Salas Romer presented himself as a modern, pragmatic alternative. He had governed efficiently, distanced himself from the old parties, and founded his own movement, Proyecto Venezuela. In the middle of 1998, it had become clear that the election was no longer a four-way race. It was becoming a showdown between Salas Romer and Hugo Chávez. And that is when Venezuela's economic elites began to panic. At first, the business elite rejected Chavez. The former coup leader had barely 8% in the polls, and many saw him as vulgar, erratic, and dangerous. One would assume that Chavez would have been an unthinkable option for Venezuela's most powerful businessmen. But by mid-1998, they were running out of alternatives. Irene Sáez had collapsed, Luis Alfarrusero had no chance, and Chavez just kept rising. That left only two viable candidates, Enrique Salas Romer and Hugo Chávez. So the question for Venezuela's elites became, who should they back? That's when one of the campaign's most important meetings took place, between Chavez and a man called Gustavo Cisneros, the billionaire owner of one of the largest TV networks in the country, Venevisión. Cisneros feared Chavez, and the meeting was tense. He worried that a Chavez government might seize his companies and destroy his media empire. But Chavez kept rising in the polls. By August 1998, Chavez was polling at around 40%, while Salas Romer remained stuck at nearly 20%. The other two candidates remained in the single digits. So the oligarchs had a choice: try to stop Chavez or try to make a deal with him. In the end, many of them chose the deal. On August 27, 1998, 3 months before Election Day, Chavez met again with Cisneros. And after that meeting, the tone in parts of the media began to change dramatically. The same television networks that had once treated Chavez as a dangerous radical now softened his image. He received more airtime, friendly interviews, and much better coverage. Other businessmen then followed. One lent Chavez his private airline so that he could travel the country during the campaign. The same elites who had once dismissed Chavez now concluded that if he was going to win the election, it was better to be close to him than to be his enemy. They had made a pact with their devil, and Chavez had made a pact with his, the oligarchy. By late 1998, the election had become a choice between two outsider candidates, Salas Romer and Chavez. And that was a problem for Chavez, because Salas Romer was not Acción Democrática. He was not Copey. He had spent years presenting himself as an independent alternative to the old political class. So if Chavez wanted to win, he needed Venezuelans to believe something else, that Salas Romer was just another politician of the old regime. Remember, above all else, the 1998 election was a referendum on the old system. Venezuelans despised Acción Democrática and Copey. Any candidate associated with them was doomed. Chavez's strategy was straightforward: tie Salas Romer to the old parties, to the rich businessmen, and to the same elites that Venezuelans wanted punished. The irony, of course, was that it was actually Chavez who had quietly won the backing of those powerful interests he claimed to reject. By the final months of the campaign, Chavez was no longer the isolated outsider he had once been. Important figures in the banking sector and owners of major television networks had begun to see him as their best option, or at least as the candidate most likely to help them defeat their rivals. These same networks, which had once treated Chavez as a dangerous radical, now began to help him. They gave him more airtime, softened his image, and amplified the idea that Salas Romer was secretly the candidate of the old order. Years later, Salas Romer confirmed this. He claimed that during the last months of the campaign, reporters suddenly stopped following him, while television ads flooded airwaves attacking him and elevating Chavez. Whether or not he exaggerated, one thing remains clear. Chavez benefited enormously from the support of sectors of Venezuela's economic elites. Then, in the final weeks before the election, Chavez received the gift he needed. Acción Democrática and COPEI panicked. Realizing that neither Irene Sáez nor Luis Alfaro could stop Chavez, they abandoned their own candidates and threw their support behind Salas Romer in a last-ditch attempt to stop the former coup leader. Inside Acción Democrática, the decision sparked chaos. The party leadership tried to remove Alfaro as its candidate, but the old party boss refused to step aside. Meanwhile, Salas Romer, who had made a point of never associating himself with the old parties, now found himself reluctantly accepting their support. But he only accepted the endorsement of Acción Democrática and COPEI's regional organizations, not their national leadership. It was his way of keeping his distance, but it didn't matter. Suddenly, Salas Romer became exactly what Chavez had spent months portraying him to be, the candidate of Acción Democrática, COPEI, and the old political class Venezuelans had grown to hate. On December 6, 1998, Hugo Chávez won with 56% of the vote. In one election, Venezuela's two-party system had all but collapsed, and the man who had promised to destroy the oligarchy had reached power with its help. Many Venezuelans feared that Chavez would lead the country toward authoritarianism, but many others, disgusted with the political class and desperate for change, were willing to take that risk. It was that desperation that carried Hugo Chávez to the presidency, but Chavez didn't get there alone. From the shadows, a group of Venezuelan businessmen and media owners helped clear his path to power. They believed that they could manipulate the former coup leader, a man with no experience in the world of business or high politics. After all, they controlled the banks, the television stations, the newspapers, and some of the largest companies in the country. If Chavez wanted to govern, surely he would need them. But they were wrong. Chavez never intended to share power. He intended to destroy the old order and replace it. And the same elites who had helped bring him there would soon discover that they had made a terrible mistake. In the town of San Francisco de Yare, every year, masked devils dance through the streets in careful rhythm. They bow, they spin, they circle one another, believing that they control the dance. But when you dance with the devils, sooner or later, the music stops. And when it did, Venezuela's old elites discovered that they were no longer leading the dance. They were the ones being led.